Hello everyone, and welcome back. Imagine a city shimmering in the morning sun, where stone causeways cross glittering canals and the air carries the sound of drums and trading voices. In the center stands a stone platform, simple, solemn, open to everyone. There is no courtroom hidden behind walls, no whispered verdict. Here, justice happens in the sunlight. The people of Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec world, believed that order was not only social but cosmic. The gods had once sacrificed themselves to keep the sun alive. In return, humans were meant to maintain the rhythm of the universe through duty, ritual, and law. Every rule, every sentence, was another heartbeat for the cosmos. The Aztecs built one of the most structured legal systems of the pre-modern world. Every city had judges called Tecutli, men chosen not by wealth but by wisdom and restraint. They heard disputes about land, trade, marriage, or theft, and their word carried weight. Above them were appeal courts for serious crimes, and at the summit sat the emperor himself, who could overturn or confirm verdicts. But unlike today's courts, Aztec law was not buried in paper. It lived through sight and memory. There were no prisons, no long sentences. Justice was swift and visible, a performance meant to teach. In the marketplace, the empire's heartbeat rules kept life moving. Thousands of people sold food, jewelry, fabrics, and feathers. Inspectors watched the stalls, checking weights and dyes. If someone cheated a buyer, the punishment was public. A dishonest merchant might have his stall overturned, his goods scattered, and his hands bound while others passed by. It was humiliation. But it was also education. The act reminded everyone that the value of trust was higher than the price of goods. Crimes were not treated as simple matters between individuals. They were believed to disturb the natural balance that linked gods, rulers, and commoners. A lie or a theft was not just a mistake. It was a small crack in the wall that held up the world. Restoring harmony meant not only punishing the wrongdoer but also showing the community what went wrong. That is why so many punishments were symbolic. A thief might be forced to wear his shame in the form of paint or shaved hair. A lazy worker might carry an enormous bundle of wood through the streets. The punishment became a story that the crowd could repeat, a living reminder. Even children were taught through ritual correction. The most famous example was the chili smoke hut. When a child disobeyed or acted with arrogance, parents placed them in a small room where burning chilies filled the air. The sting and the tears were unforgettable, but the child left unharmed. To Aztec eyes, this was not cruelty. It was education. It reminded young people of their place within the family and the divine order. The goal was never endless suffering, it was moral memory. Justice also followed strict lines of status. The Aztecs believed that privilege carried heavier responsibility. A noble caught lying or drinking excessively could face death, while a commoner might receive only public shame or labor duty. Harsh, perhaps, but in their reasoning, the higher you stood, the louder your mistakes echoed. Leadership was meant to be moral first, powerful second. Many offenses were tied to religion because the sacred and the civic could not be separated. Cutting down a sacred tree, for example, was not just property damage, it was an insult to the spirit that lived inside it. Adultery was not merely betrayal. It broke family alliances that stabilized the empire. Drunkenness among the young was feared not because of intoxication itself, but because it symbolized weakness in discipline, the quality that kept society and the cosmos aligned. In all these cases, the response was meant to restore equilibrium, not vengeance. Because prisons did not exist, there was little space for lingering guilt. Justice moved fast. Once the punishment was carried out, life continued. The point was to purge disorder quickly so it could not spread. In this way, the legal system worked as a form of community hygiene, cleansing through example. To us, it might seem brutal. To them, it was balance in motion. The Aztecs were also remarkable record keepers. Legal decisions were painted on bark paper or deer skin, each symbol representing an event, a name, or a judgment. These codices acted as a living archive of behavior, proof that justice had been done. Over time, they became teaching tools for judges and scribes, ensuring that law stayed consistent even across distant provinces. Behind this structure was a philosophy deeper than fear. The Aztecs saw life as a continuous negotiation between chaos and order. Every sunrise was a victory won by effort and discipline. The courts and punishments were extensions of that same cosmic negotiation. They reminded everyone, farmer, noble, merchant, or child, that harmony was fragile and had to be renewed through action. When European chroniclers later described these customs, they often called them barbaric, unable to see the logic within. But if we look carefully, we can sense a system that prized visibility and accountability, values not so distant from ours. The Aztecs understood something essential about human behavior: people remember what they can see. A law written on paper fades into abstraction. A man painted with soot, walking silently through the market, becomes a story no one forgets. There is, in that, a strange kind of empathy. The goal was not secret punishment or prolonged imprisonment, but social reintegration through shared awareness. A wrong was exposed, discussed, learned from. The offender was rarely invisible. He was part of a narrative that warned others and gave the community a chance to reflect. In a way, every punishment was a mirror held up to society. If you stood in that plaza and watched, you would feel two things: fear and understanding. Fear, because the line between order and chaos was clear and thin. Understanding, because the law was not an abstraction but a rhythm everyone could hear. The system worked because it was collective. Justice did not belong to the ruler alone. It belonged to the entire city, to the gods who watched, and to the citizens who learned by looking. The Aztec legal world leaves us with questions that still echo today. Is justice stronger when it is visible? Does shame teach more effectively than confinement? Can punishment ever repair balance rather than simply inflict pain? These are not ancient questions. They are modern ones dressed in feather and stone. The city is gone now. The plaza lies beneath Mexico City streets. But sometimes, when sunlight cuts across the old ruins of the Templo Mayor, you can almost feel the pulse of that old order, the conviction that civilization survives not by hiding its rules, but by performing them. The Aztecs believed justice was a public act, a conversation between gods and people written in ritual, color, and consequence. And perhaps, in their own severe way, they were right: law only works when everyone can see it. In every Aztec household, morality began before the marketplace, before the temple, before the law. It began in the home, where parents were both teachers and priests of small, everyday rituals. The empire's strength, they believed, rested not only on its armies or its gods but on the quiet obedience of children who understood their place in the great pattern of life. Families were miniature versions of the cosmos, each one responsible for keeping its balance. Education was not optional. From the moment a child could walk, they were taught duty, modesty, and respect. Boys were trained to work, to carry water, to till the soil, and later to fight when called. Girls learned the arts of weaving, cooking, and managing the household. But instruction was not only practical. It was deeply moral. Every act, cleaning, sweeping, preparing food, was considered a way to honor the gods. To neglect it was not laziness. It was spiritual disorder. Parents guided through words and examples. But when words failed, correction followed. The Aztecs believed that a small dose of discomfort could plant lifelong understanding. The most famous and often misunderstood of these methods was the chili smoke ritual. When a child repeatedly disobeyed, the parent would place burning chili peppers on the hearth, letting the sharp smoke fill a small enclosed space. The child was asked to sit inside for a short time, not long enough to cause injury. Only long enough to bring tears and a sting to the nose and eyes. It was a lesson written in sensation, not violence. To us, this might sound harsh, but within Aztec culture it was seen as protective love. The point was to awaken conscience, not fear. A child who cried during punishment was believed to be releasing arrogance and pride, the two roots of disobedience. Once they stepped back into the open air, the world felt cleaner, and they re-entered it as part of the order again. Elders would later tell them stories of how even gods had to endure trials to stay pure. Other forms of discipline followed the same logic of symbolic correction. A lazy boy might be pricked gently with cactus thorns to remind him that idleness was a small pain that grew large if left alone. A girl who wasted food might be asked to sweep the floor of the family courtyard, the act turning shame into service. There were no cruel beatings, no endless confinement. Everything aimed to realign the spirit. Parents carried immense responsibility. In Aztec thought, raising a child was an act of cosmic significance. Every father and mother were gardeners tending the seeds of future warriors, priests, and artisans. To neglect that duty was itself a moral failure. A child's behavior reflected the parent's strength, and their household's honor. When a family fell into disorder, the entire neighborhood noticed. In a world where the personal and divine overlapped, the home was the first temple, and the parents its custodians. Children grew up hearing proverbs that blended poetry with practicality. Like a precious jade, a child must be carved with care, one saying went. He who does not sweat as a youth will weep as a man, said another. These were not threats but reminders. Life was work, and work was sacred. Every household echoed the empire's larger rhythm: effort, order, and renewal. As children aged, education shifted to schools. Boys from common families attended the Telpakali, the house of youth, where they learned farming, warfare, and civic duty. Sons of nobles went to the Kalmakak, the house of lineage, where they studied history, astronomy, and leadership. Yet even there, discipline remained moral and spiritual. Teachers were strict but fair, guiding students to endure hunger, cold, and fatigue as preparation for adult life. A student caught lying or shirking tasks might be forced to sweep public roads or carry water to the temple. Again, the punishment was not revenge, it was instruction through humility. Through all of this ran a single principle: the correction of behavior was also the cultivation of the soul. The Aztecs did not separate body from spirit, pain from meaning, or lesson from ritual. A child who learned obedience through brief discomfort would grow into an adult capable of endurance and self-control. In a society where every harvest depended on cooperation, and every festival required precision, discipline was not tyranny, it was survival. We can still sense the emotional intelligence inside this system, even if its forms seem alien now. The chilly smoke, the cactus pricks, the public chores, all were physical metaphors for abstract lessons. They told children that mistakes carry weight, but also that redemption is quick once you correct them. The family did not exile or shame forever. It purified and reintegrated. This domestic discipline also reflected how the Aztecs viewed the universe. The cosmos itself was alive, sensitive, and reactive. When storms came or crops failed, people believed imbalance had crept into human behavior, perhaps too much greed, arrogance, or neglect of duty. Children, therefore, were taught to feel responsibility toward more than themselves. Their small acts of discipline were miniature versions of cosmic order. Learning obedience was learning harmony with the gods. The methods were tough but bound by structure. There was no randomness, no cruelty for its own sake. Even punishments were performed with ceremony, parents fasting beforehand. elders offering counsel afterward. Once the correction ended, the incident was not revisited. The lesson was learned, the child forgiven, and balance restored. That rhythm disorder, correction, renewal mirrored the pattern of the seasons, the rise and fall of the sun, the beating heart of the empire. In a way, the chili smoke ritual reveals something profound about how the Aztecs understood education. They did not think of morality as something you taught with books or speeches. It had to be felt through body, breath, and emotion. You learned not just with the mind but with the senses. A child might forget a sermon, but never the feeling of that sharp smoke clearing their pride. It was a living lesson that carried into adulthood. Later, when that child grew into a soldier, artisan, or merchant, they already knew the meaning of endurance. They had learned early that pain can be informative, that humility protects against greater harm, and that balance requires attention. In the collective life of the city, this made citizens who could be trusted to follow rules without constant supervision. The empire's legal system worked because its households had already prepared its people to accept structure as natural. There is something quietly brilliant in that arrangement. The state did not have to impose obedience by force. It grew obedience organically, inside families, through everyday practice. What began as household discipline matured into civic stability. The same principle that governed a child's behavior governed a judge's verdict, correction through clarity. If you step back, you can see the continuum from home to empire. The chilly smoke of the kitchen becomes the black soot of the marketplace punishment. The parent's short lecture becomes the judge's public decree. It is the same language, scaled up. Private virtue and public justice spoke with the same voice. Modern readers might recoil from the methods, but the insight remains powerful. Education works best when it engages body, memory, and community together. The Aztecs understood that rules alone do not create morality, experience does. To teach a lesson, you must make it real enough to remember. And perhaps, in our world of distant laws and quiet discipline, that is the part worth recalling. They believed that to guide a person, you had to let them feel the edge of their mistake, then guide them gently back. That is not just control, it is craftsmanship of the soul. In the Aztec world, justice worked on a scale, not a single blow. Every crime carried its own rhythm of warning, correction, and final consequence. The system was built to give people a chance to change but also to prove that choices mattered. Law was not about emotion. It was about restoring balance, and balance required proportion. When someone stole, the first step was almost always restitution. A thief had to return what they took, often with an added share as repayment. It was less about revenge than about repairing the thread that had been torn. But if the same hand reached out again, the law's patience thinned. Repeat offenders were marked in public, shaved, painted, or forced to carry symbolic burdens so their neighbors could see both the warning and the mercy still left. If they still refused to learn, the penalties grew darker. Fraud was treated as poison, because it corroded the trust that made trade possible. In a city of thousands, the marketplace was sacred. It was where the empire's veins met. A merchant who cheated weights or dyed goods falsely was more than a liar, he endangered the heartbeat of the economy. Inspectors would expose such deceit in the plaza itself. The first exposure was humiliation. The second could mean enslavement to repay the loss. Beyond that, the market door closed forever, and sometimes, so did the door to life. Lying, too, was not a private sin. In a society that depended on verbal oaths and public vows, a lie could unravel justice itself. A false witness or perjurer did not just risk personal dishonor. They invited disorder into the courtroom. And through it, into the world. The Aztecs punished false testimony with poetic symmetry. The liar suffered the same fate that their lie had sought to bring on another. Truth was treated as sacred currency. Once counterfeited, it could not be trusted again. Yet the law's hand was not blind. It looked carefully at intent and status. For the poor, theft from hunger could sometimes be pardoned with labor. For the rich, who had no such excuse, the punishment multiplied. Nobles who abused their power faced harsher fates than commoners because their example carried further. They were expected to embody discipline. Failure from the top spread rot downward. The empire believed that to keep order, those who led must suffer first when order failed. This sense of graduated justice revealed a rare awareness of scale. The Aztecs knew that punishment worked best when people could see cause and effect. A small crime brought a small scar. A large betrayal brought finality. It was a living calculus designed to make citizens feel that justice was not arbitrary but inevitable. Every penalty taught a moral, that the community's survival depended on restraint, honesty, and the willingness to repair what one had broken. Behind this order was something more spiritual. The Aztecs did not think of guilt as a stain to be hidden. They thought of it as imbalance to be corrected. A person could restore harmony through restitution, confession, or sacrifice acts that realigned them with the world's rhythm. The worst punishment was not pain. It was disconnection. To be cut off from the market, from the city, from ritual life, was to lose meaning itself. Even the process of escalation carried humanity. The law offered steps, warnings, chances, clear thresholds. Everyone knew the ladder, and everyone knew where it ended. It was not chaos disguised as order. It was order sharpened into memory. In that precision lay a strange mercy. People always knew the rules. There were no hidden traps, no unseen judges. Only the visible weight of their own choices. Through these punishments, the Aztec Empire kept its people bound together not by fear but by understanding. Justice was predictable, visible, and communal. Each verdict was a performance meant to remind the city of how fragile harmony could be, and how easily one act could tilt the balance of the world. To the Aztecs, the world was not a collection of objects. It was a breathing network of powers: sun, rain, wind, maize, fire, all alive, all watching. Human beings lived inside that web, not above it. Every act, every lie, every kindness, every broken promise sent a vibration through the whole structure. When someone committed a crime, the injury did not stop at the victim. It traveled upward, outward, touching gods and ancestors. Law, therefore, was not simply a set of civic rules. It was a ritual practice that repaired damage to the universe. Adultery, idleness, or cutting down a sacred tree might seem like personal or trivial acts to us. But to the Aztecs, they were fractures in the fabric of creation. Adultery violated trust, yes, but it also disrupted lineage, which was the living chain that connected mortals to the gods. A lazy worker did not just waste time. He weakened the rhythm of labor that kept cities fed and temples supplied. To cut a sacred tree was to wound the spirit inside it, a direct insult to the divine order that gave that tree life. Everything was linked through Teotl, the sacred energy that flowed through all things. To stay balanced with Teotl meant to live correctly, to act, speak, and even think in harmony with the pattern of creation. Law was not separate from religion. It was one of the ways people kept Teotl aligned. Punishment was not revenge. It was ritual correction, a physical act that turned disorder into symmetry again. Temples and courts were built on the same foundations, both places where balance was restored. Priests offered sacrifice to nourish the gods, while judges offered justice to stabilize society. The two gestures mirrored each other: blood for the sky, fairness for the earth. The belief was simple but strict: if humans kept the world in moral order, the gods would keep it turning. Because of this worldview, many Aztec laws targeted behaviors that threatened harmony rather than those that merely caused harm. Gossip that incited conflict, Laziness during communal work, or intoxication in the wrong context, all of these were treated as dangerous not because they were scandalous, but because they loosened the threads of discipline that held society together. The penalties could be severe, but they were always symbolic. The aim was to make the imbalance visible so the world could see it corrected. The concept of cosmic order also explained the empire's hierarchy. The emperor, the Hui Teuta, was not a monarch by divine right alone, he was a pivot point between heaven and earth. His behavior set the tone for the entire cosmos. If he ruled justly, rains would come, harvests would flourish, children would live. If he strayed into corruption, even the stars might falter. That burden of representation extended downward. Nobles, priests, warriors, and commoners all carried their portion of cosmic responsibility. One striking example was the law against cutting sacred trees. Certain species, especially those growing near temples or used in rituals, were considered living intermediaries between realms. To harm them was to interrupt communication with the divine. When such a crime occurred, the punishment was both physical and moral. Offenders might be required to plant new trees, offer restitution to the temple, or face public ceremony of repentance. The community watched not to gloat, but to witness restoration. The world had to see the wound heal. Adultery carried a different weight. It was not only about personal betrayal. It was about breaking sacred contracts between families and gods. Marriage was seen as a covenant that anchored social and cosmic order. To violate it was to risk disorder spreading through the lineage. In some cases, offenders were permanently separated from ritual life, they became spiritually out of tune. Others faced death. Not as punishment for passion, but as a purification of imbalance. The act was understood as returning the dissonant note to silence. Idleness, too, was treated as moral decay. Work, whether in fields or crafts, was sacred participation in the rhythm of the gods. The sun worked every day, how could humans do less? Those who avoided labor without cause were shamed publicly or forced into tasks that restored their worth. This was not merely economic pressure. It was cosmological hygiene. The empire survived because every hand moved in harmony with the cycle of the seasons. A single idle body was a note off key. Even drinking had a cosmic code. Alcoholic pulque was reserved for ceremonies, elders, and those whose service to the gods required it. For youth, drunkenness symbolized chaos, a collapse of discipline that could spread to the body politic. The first offense might bring humiliation. The second could mean exile. In a world where divine favor depended on human restraint, losing control of oneself was a risk to everyone. What is fascinating is how these ideas blurred the boundary between morality and physics. Sin was not a legal category. It was a cosmic vibration gone wrong. Justice, therefore, was not limited to humans, it was environmental, agricultural, astronomical. A drought, a failed harvest. A disease outbreak, all could be read as the gods' commentary on human imbalance. The solution was not only ritual prayer. It was social correction. People looked inward and asked, where had harmony been broken? Which rule, which vow, which act of negligence had rippled outward into the skies? This way of thinking made society deeply interdependent. A farmer cared about the merchant's honesty, because a dishonest sale could anger the gods of abundance. A priest cared about a soldier's discipline, because arrogance in war might insult the war god. Everyone's virtue mattered. Law became not just protection but participation, a communal effort to keep the sun burning. That is why Aztec punishments were rarely private. They were performed for eyes and memory. The crowd watching a public sentence was not just observing justice. They were witnessing a ritual of renewal. The wrong was being drawn out, exposed to light, and symbolically healed. When it was done, the city could breathe again. The gods, having seen order restored, could allow the sun to rise tomorrow. From a modern perspective, such intertwining of faith and law might seem oppressive, but for the Aztecs, it was liberation from chaos. They did not fear punishment as much as they feared cosmic decay, the slow unraveling of meaning. Law was their way of keeping existence coherent. It gave people something solid to hold on to in a universe where the divine was vast and unpredictable. If you picture the empire at dusk, its temples glowing red in the last light, you can almost feel that sense of equilibrium. The priests preparing offerings, the judges concluding trials, the farmers finishing their work, all performing versions of the same ritual, giving structure to life so that life would continue. In that unity of purpose, even harsh laws took on a strange dignity. They were not cruelty, but choreography, a dance meant to keep the stars in their places. And that might be the deepest truth of Aztec cosmology: every act mattered. The sweep of a courtyard, the honesty of a trade, the fidelity of a promise, all of it was sacred maintenance. Their laws simply reminded people of that fact, sometimes gently, sometimes fiercely. The stakes were cosmic, the lesson eternal: to live in harmony was to keep the universe alive. Justice in the Aztec Empire was never quiet. It lived in plazas, under sunlight, where everyone could see. The trial of one person became the instruction of many. Every judgment, every punishment, was meant to echo beyond its victim into the crowd, into the city, into the memory of 1,000 gossiping voices. Law was not hidden behind walls. It was lived and watched. Imagine the square at Tenochtitlan's heart. Merchants are packing up their goods, the smell of maize and chili lingers in the air. And suddenly the crowd parts. Guards appear, carrying a man painted black with soot, the color of shame. He has stolen from the market, and today, he will pay for it. There are no speeches, no lawyers, no curtains. Just the rhythm of the city pausing for a lesson. The judge's verdict is read aloud, calm, ritualistic, almost liturgical. The crowd listens, not to celebrate cruelty, but to witness balance being restored. When punishment follows a flogging, a shaving, a symbolic humiliation, it is not just the thief who learns. Everyone watching learns. Mothers clutch their children's hands. Merchants glance at their scales. The message moves silently: justice is not hidden. It breathes among you. This public nature of law gave it power beyond fear. It was not simply deterrence, it was choreography. The Aztecs knew that shame lasts longer than pain. A public punishment engraved memory deeper than any scroll could. A man paraded with torn clothes became a moving warning. His humiliation was education for the whole community. Even executions had theater in them. The condemned were dressed according to the nature of their crime: adulterers in plain robes, liars painted black, thieves stripped of symbols of status. The act was never random. It was visual language: each color, each gesture, a coded message about moral imbalance and divine correction. The city itself became a stage of morality. Markets were arenas of trust. Temples stood as courts of balance. The emperor, standing above all, symbolized the union of the sacred and judicial. When a trial was conducted, it was not just a bureaucratic procedure, it was a reenactment of cosmic law. The judges represented not only authority but the God's eyes on earth. Children were often brought to witness punishments. Parents did not shield them from the spectacle. Instead, they whispered lessons: see that man, he lied. See that woman, she betrayed trust. Remember this. It was a pedagogy of fear, yes, but also of belonging. To watch punishment was to learn that the city's harmony depended on everyone's behavior. There was also beauty in the order of it. Unlike the chaos of mob justice found in other ancient societies, Aztec punishments were rehearsed, precise, and deliberate. Timing mattered. The crowd had its place. The tone of the announcer mattered. The space between crime and punishment was kept short so the moral connection remained clear in everyone's mind. No one forgot why the act occurred. The offense and its consequence stood side by side. Even architecture reinforced this public justice. Temples and court platforms were often aligned so that sunlight struck them during trials, a symbolic gesture of divine illumination. Some punishments were carried out near sacred altars, reminding all that law and religion were bound together. When the crowd dispersed, they carried the moral residue home like dust on their clothes. Public trials also reinforced hierarchy. Nobles who fell from grace were punished more severely, not because the law was cruel, but because their failure threatened the moral symmetry of the whole empire. A noble's shame was a spectacle of cosmic proportions. His punishment showed that even those closest to the gods could fall, and that fall served as purification for everyone else. The entire city functioned like an organism of morality, where each public act of justice was a pulse keeping it alive. In that light, the harshness of Aztec punishment becomes less about brutality and more about maintenance. It was moral architecture, every sentence, every ceremony, every crowd a pillar holding up order against the collapse of chaos. If you walked through Tenochtitlan on a day of judgment, you might feel both horror and awe. You would see the precision in every movement, the silence after each strike, the faces of witnesses absorbing the spectacle like scripture. And when the punishment ended, the plaza returned to its rhythm. Merchants called out prices again, children laughed, priests chanted nearby. Life resumed, a little tenser, perhaps, but balanced. The memory stayed. People would retell what they saw that day over meals and fires, in markets and homes. The story became a moral echo, not of cruelty, but of restoration. "Did you hear?" someone would say. "He stole from the gods' market, and now he is gone." And the listener would nod, not with pity, but with acceptance. The story had done its work. In the end, the Aztec courtroom was not a place of debate. It was a place of performance. The audience was the conscience of the empire. Justice, when seen, became belief. Fear turned to understanding, understanding to order. In that delicate cycle, public punishment was not the breakdown of civilization, it was its heartbeat. And perhaps that is the unsettling genius of it. They understood something modern systems often forget, that morality is not shaped in silence. It is shaped where everyone can see. To the Aztecs, the idea of locking someone away for years would have felt absurd, even cowardly. Time was sacred. Wasting it in a cell was a form of decay. Justice had to move quickly, not in years but in hours, so its meaning stayed alive in memory. Every punishment was a message, and messages fade if whispered too late. So instead of prisons, the Aztecs built something more enduring, a system where consequence replaced confinement. They had no walls of stone for criminals, only the open air of the plaza and the eyes of their peers. If someone broke the law, the question was not how long should we hide them. It was what lesson must everyone learn. That logic shaped everything: the swiftness of trials, the symbolism of punishments, the rhythm of mercy and severity that governed their society. Their justice was kinetic. When a thief was caught, he faced the marketplace almost immediately. When a liar was exposed, the stain on his lips appeared before sunset. A noble who betrayed the trust of his people did not languish in waiting. His trial was swift, his fall deliberate, his lesson eternal. The Aztecs understood something we often forget: delayed justice loses its voice. To them, a sentence postponed was a lesson lost. The courts were efficient, not because they lacked compassion, but because they saw time as part of morality. The gods themselves kept time: sunrise, rainfall, harvest, all running in precise cycles. When humans delayed judgment, they disrupted that cosmic rhythm. So a crime, like a wound, had to be cleaned before it festered. Justice worked the same way: fast, visible, cleansing. In this world, punishment was not about revenge or control. It was communication. A flogging in the market told the crowd that theft endangered trust. A public shaming showed that deceit wounded the community. An execution rare but spectacular reminded everyone that some acts unmade the order itself. And then it ended. There was no endless punishment, no forgotten prisoners. Once balance was restored, life moved on. Aztec law worked like a heartbeat, sharp contractions of judgment, followed by long stretches of peace. The empire did not warehouse offenders. It recycled them into warnings, stories, examples. A man who once stole could become a living parable, his memory keeping others from the same path. The act of justice was not about removal, it was about transformation. Even execution was seen not as deletion, but release, the spirit purified through suffering, returned to the cosmic cycle cleansed. Because of this immediacy, the Aztec courts were remarkably lean. A few judges presided over enormous districts, yet order held. There were no sprawling prisons draining the treasury, no endless debates over reform. The people understood the system because it spoke their language, direct, moral, symbolic. It did not demand bureaucracy. It demanded belief. To modern minds, it might sound merciless. But imagine living in a world where punishment was not hidden, where justice was not abstract. Everyone saw what happened, everyone knew the rules. The result was not paranoia, but clarity. You did not fear a system. You feared breaking trust with the world itself. Aztec judges had power, but they were also bound by ritual responsibility. Before major verdicts, they fasted, prayed, and abstained from indulgence, ensuring their mind was clean. Judgment was sacred labor, misusing it was as sinful as murder. A corrupt judge could face execution, not for political reasons, but for spiritual contamination. The law was sacred text, and the judge was its temporary voice. To twist that voice was to blaspheme. And so, the empire stayed efficient. When guilt was proven, the punishment came swiftly, often the same day. Some criminals were fined or publicly humiliated. Others were enslaved temporarily, their labor repaying both debt and dignity. Those who could not or would not reform met final judgment, their bodies becoming symbols of order restored. The point was never to torture. It was to finish the lesson completely. Even their architecture reflected this philosophy. The Aztecs built no dungeons beneath their temples. Instead, they built courtyards wide enough for the crowd to gather, spaces designed for seeing and remembering. The plaza was the empire's conscience, polished by countless eyes. Every crime was a disturbance in that mirror. Every punishment, a restoration of reflection. You could say they traded mercy for meaning, but that is too simple. In their eyes, immediacy was mercy. Why stretch out suffering? Why leave a person half alive in a cell, forgotten by all? Better a quick reckoning and a chance for the soul to begin again in this life or the next. They believed in renewal, not containment. Because there were no prisons, the Aztecs also avoided one of modern society's quiet cruelties, invisibility. Their criminals did not vanish behind bars. Their suffering was not hidden from the community that had been wronged. The people saw justice happen, felt its weight, and could then move forward. Guilt was not a permanent identity, it was a phase, a shadow that could be burned away in the light of day. The absence of prisons also shaped their architecture of memory. Instead of institutions full of silence and regret, they had stories, folk tales, moral warnings, neighborhood recollections of the man who once lied and now sells honestly. These oral records became the empire's invisible archive, stronger and more persuasive than stone cells ever could be. Of course, it was not perfect. Some punishments went too far. Some judges erred. Some innocent people paid with their lives. But the system's foundation remained clear: law was not about locking people away, but about keeping the moral rhythm of the world intact. A society that punished swiftly could also forgive swiftly. There was no backlog of sin. No accumulation of resentment. Only balance disturbed, restored, disturbed again, like the steady motion of waves. If you stood in Tenochtitlan and watched justice unfold, you would feel both the harshness and the grace of it. The condemned bowed their heads, the crowd murmured, the judge lifted his hand, and then silence. A clean cut, a restored rhythm. Within minutes, life resumed, vendors called out. Drums beat in the temples, children ran across the square. Nothing lingered. Justice, like rain, had fallen and passed. And maybe that is what the Aztecs grasped most clearly: punishment is not about duration. It is about meaning. A single moment, made visible, can teach more than a lifetime behind walls. They left no prisons because they did not need them. Their real cells were in memory, and those, once learned from, could open. The Adriatic Sea can look soft at dawn, pale blue glass, gentle swells, but it has always hidden ambition. In the 3rd century before Christ, a queen stood on its cliffs and watched ships move across her horizon, ships not hers. Her name was Teuta of Illyria, and she ruled a coast of stone and storms. The world would remember her not for mercy or marriage, but for how she refused to kneel. Teuta inherited a kingdom that thrived on the edge of law. The Illyrians were seafarers, traders, and when convenient, pirates. They knew every cove and current between what is now Albania and Croatia. Their ships were light and fast, their loyalty elastic. Power in Illyria was not built from palaces. It was carved into cliffs. When King Agron, Teuta's husband, died suddenly around 231 BCE, the throne passed to her, a woman in a world allergic to women's authority. Most rulers might have sought allies, treaties, compromise. Teuta did the opposite. She expanded the very practice that made her people feared piracy. Her corsairs preyed on merchant ships from the Greek cities and, increasingly, from Rome. The sea became her empire's true border. Traders complained, but Teuta dismissed them. "It is our custom," she reportedly told Roman envoys, "that our people may enrich themselves upon the sea." It was not just defiance, it was philosophy. Teuta's Illyria did not recognize Rome's idea of peace, because peace, to them, meant submission. The Adriatic was their livelihood, their inheritance, their right to take what fortune allowed. To her, piracy was not crime. It was commerce by courage. And for a brief, furious time, that belief worked. Her fleet struck Greek ports, seized cargo, and spread fear along the coast. Rome, still expanding but not yet invincible, tried diplomacy first. 2 Roman ambassadors were sent to negotiate, demanding Teuta restrain her corsairs. One spoke too boldly. Teuta's response was legendary and disastrous. She let one envoy live to carry her message back: Illyria bows to no one. The other never returned. That death lit the fuse for Rome's first war across the Adriatic. When the Roman fleet arrived, it was not just military might, it was moral theater, the same kind the Aztecs once staged, but on water. Rome wanted to make an example of Teuta. To show the world what happens when defiance challenges order. The campaign was swift, decisive, and deliberate. Teuta's ports fell one by one. Her allies surrendered. The Illyrian sea that had once whispered her name began to echo Rome's. But even in defeat, Teuta refused to vanish quietly. She negotiated peace herself, another scandal in a patriarchal world, and withdrew to a small fortress city, where she ruled the remaining lands under Roman oversight. Some accounts claim she continued to resist in secret. Others say she faded into silence, her end lost to time. Yet history's fragments show the same shape, a woman who dared to confront the largest empire of her age, and who paid the exact price she expected to pay. Rome called her a pirate queen. Later chroniclers painted her as savage, deceitful, or reckless. But beneath their bias, another story flickers, one of calculation and courage. Teuta was not just a raider. She was a ruler in a geopolitical trap. Between Macedonia, Greece, and Rome, her survival depended on movement. To stand still was to die. Her piracy was not rebellion for rebellion's sake, it was strategy disguised as defiance. And what is strange is how the world remembered her. Centuries later, in the lands she once ruled, Teuta became a symbol of pride, the sea queen who never yielded. Albanian poets sang of her as both warrior and widow, fierce and tragic. The same act Rome condemned as piracy became, in time, patriotism, a small nation's way of saying no to giants. Her legend reveals something universal about power and punishment. The Romans believed they were enforcing order. Teuta believed she was defending her world's rhythm. Each side claimed justice. Each saw the other as chaos. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the tide between them. Standing on those cliffs now, you can still see the water that joined and divided them. The Adriatic has not changed much, same wind, same salt. Somewhere out there, perhaps, the echo of Teuta's ships lingers. Every empire that sails it afterward inherits her lesson: power is never permanent, and defiance, once voiced, never fully dies. Teuta's story folds neatly into the larger theme of law and consequence that shaped civilizations everywhere. Like the Aztecs, she understood that authority depends on visibility. Her piracy was not shadow work, it was public theater. The Romans answered in kind, turning their retaliation into spectacle. Both sides believed they were performing cosmic roles, she, the challenger of imperial arrogance. They, the restorers of order. It is tempting to see Teuta's fall as inevitable, but history rarely gives us pure villains or heroes. She lived in a world where survival meant improvisation, and she played her hand until the sea turned against her. Even her loss carried meaning. She showed that a single act of defiance could force empires to reveal what they feared most: a woman who needed no permission to rule. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear her response to Rome's demands, calm, unshaken, a voice carried by the wind off the sea: tell them it is our custom. It is the kind of answer that transcends time, half arrogance, half prayer. Not the cry of a pirate, but the whisper of someone who understood that to live free, even briefly, is worth the ruin it brings. Her life, like the Aztecs' laws, was a study in visibility, to make power seen, to make meaning public. And like all who live by that creed, Teuta discovered that the world remembers those who choose defiance over silence. Her name survives not in the ledgers of Rome, but in the waves that never quite stopped carrying her story. Rome had always known how to make punishment a performance. When Queen Teuta defied them, she did not just threaten their trade routes, she bruised their pride. And for Rome, pride was policy. The Republic could forgive theft, rebellion, even bloodshed, but never embarrassment. A woman ruling from a cliffside fortress, declaring that piracy was her custom, was a challenge they could not ignore. So they turned her defiance into theater, and the Adriatic became their stage. The Roman Senate, still rising from the wars of Italy, understood optics better than any modern empire. They did not rush in anger. They calculated spectacle. Their message would not only punish Teuta but teach the entire Mediterranean what happened to those who resisted the Roman rhythm of peace, the Pax Romana, before it even had a name. The Adriatic would no longer be a sea of small powers. It would become a Roman mirror, reflecting only one authority. The fleet they sent was not the largest Rome ever built, but it was precise enough to strike fast and be seen doing it. 2 consuls led the campaign, sailing across with disciplined legions and the confidence of inevitability. The Illyrian coast, with its scattered tribes and storm-hardened sailors, had always resisted central control. Rome turned that chaos into a map. Each conquered port was renamed, reorganized, absorbed. The empire did not just win battles. It rewrote geography. When the Romans entered Teuta's waters, they treated the campaign as ritual cleansing. Piracy was sin. Rome was purification. Their ships, heavier but relentless, pushed Illyria's smaller fleets back toward their own cliffs. The Queen's ports, once alive with the noise of traders, raiders, and fishermen, grew silent as the Roman war drums echoed across the coves. It was not a war of annihilation, but of rearrangement. Rome did not want her dead. They wanted her example to live as warning. Accounts of her surrender vary. Some say she fled inland and held out in a mountain fortress. Others describe her meeting the Roman generals herself, calm and proud even as her kingdom crumbled. What is certain is that Rome dictated every word of the peace. She was forced to abandon all sea power, surrender much of her land, and pay annual tribute. Her pirates, those quick, clever sailors who had once ruled the waves, were disbanded or absorbed into Roman service. The Adriatic was no longer Illyrian. It was disciplined. Rome made sure the story spread. Their historians, poets, and envoys told it again and again, how a defiant queen challenged the Republic and was subdued by its order. Teuta's defeat became a parable of civilization triumphing over barbarism, the classic Roman narrative. But inside that story, Rome also buried something they feared to name: admiration. Because Teuta had shown courage they secretly respected. The same fire that built their empire burned in her. Rebellion. To the Romans, order was sacred. They saw themselves as heirs to divine balance, destined to tame the unpredictable corners of the world. In their worldview, Teuta's Illyria was chaos, a wild coast where law bent to the wind. The campaign against her became a moral act, a demonstration of what Rome called discipline but what was really control. They did not just want to end piracy. They wanted to rewrite what freedom meant. And they succeeded. Within a generation, the Adriatic became a Roman lake. Ports once loyal to Teuta now flew Roman banners. Her name, once whispered in markets, was used by senators as a cautionary tale. "Let no one make the sea their kingdom," one speech reportedly warned. The message was clear: independence without permission was rebellion, and rebellion was death. But there is a shadow in every Roman victory. For all their talk of order, the empire always needed rebels to define itself. Without opposition, Rome lost its moral mirror. Teuta's defiance gave them a story, a reason to march, a shape for their destiny. In conquering her, they also confirmed their identity. Every empire needs a villain to feel virtuous, and Teuta became theirs. Yet her ghost never quite left. The Romans absorbed her land, but not her defiance. The people of Illyria, even under occupation, carried her story like salt in their blood. They remembered the queen who looked Rome in the eye and refused to apologize. In taverns and fishing villages, her legend shifted from defeat to defiance, from pirate to patriot. Even the Romans could not erase that. Teuta's fall also revealed Rome's genius and its flaw. They did not just crush enemies. They converted them into symbols. Every rebellion became another stone in the empire's monument to itself. But every monument casts a shadow. The story of Teuta lingered at the edge of Roman memory, a reminder that even order depends on the chaos it claims to destroy. Her war was small by Roman standards, but its ripples reached far. It marked the beginning of Rome's expansion into the Balkans, the first step in a chain that would lead them deep into Greece and beyond. Teuta was the spark that drew Rome eastward, the reason they learned to master the sea they once feared. Her defeat became their foundation. And yet, in a strange symmetry, both sides got what they wanted. Rome gained control of the Adriatic. Teuta gained immortality. Her defiance outlasted their empire. When Rome eventually fell, centuries later, her story was still being told along the same waters. The lesson had inverted itself, what Rome called rebellion. Others remembered as courage. Today, her name is carved into Albanian legend, her figure raised in bronze, facing the sea she once ruled. The Romans built roads and temples, but most of them crumbled. Her myth did not. It survived because people recognized themselves in her, that restless refusal to accept the world as it is handed down. The Adriatic is quiet now, its ports full of tourists instead of pirates. Its skies heavy with gulls instead of warships. But if you stand near Kotera or Shkodër at dawn, the horizon still glows with that old defiant light. It is easy to imagine a woman watching the waves, hearing the oars of her ships, believing that freedom, even brief, even doomed, was worth the storm it invited. Teuta's story, seen through Rome's reaction, becomes less about empire and more about perspective. Power always claims to bring peace. Rebellion always looks like chaos to those who benefit from order. Between the two, history decides who writes the story. Rome wrote it first, but Teuta, in silence, rewrote it over time. And that is the quiet revenge of every defiant soul. Empires rise to make examples of them, and end up carrying their memory instead. History has an old habit of punishing women twice, once in life, and again in the retelling. For Queen Teuta, the first punishment came at the hands of Rome. The second came from the pen. The Romans won the war. And then they wrote the story. To them, she was not a queen but a cautionary tale, the dangerous woman who let pride steer her into ruin. Yet behind that version, buried under centuries of dust and empire, the real Teuta kept breathing quietly, waiting for someone to hear her side. Roman chroniclers, especially Polybius and Cassius Dio, described her as arrogant, irrational, even bloodthirsty. The usual vocabulary reserved for women who frightened men. Her reign, they claimed, was chaos. Her people, savages in need of civilization. They did not write to remember her, they wrote to justify her defeat. In their hands, the queen who commanded a fleet became an allegory of disorder subdued by masculine reason. That is how empires write history, they turn the conquered into metaphors. But fragments survive that complicate the story. Greek sources hint at her political skill. Her ability to hold a fragile coalition of tribes together. Illyrian oral tradition, though filtered through later retellings, remembers her as a fierce leader who fought not for glory, but for sovereignty. Even in defeat, she governed what remained of her lands with restraint and dignity. And long after her death, her name stayed on the lips of fishermen, merchants, and mothers along the Adriatic coast, whispered with a mix of fear and pride. Centuries blurred. Empires shifted, but Teuta's image endured. In medieval chronicles, she became a ghostly figure of the sea, haunting those who challenged her waters. In Renaissance maps, her name lingered in the margins as a warning, the Queen's Coast. By the 19th century, when nationalism began to awaken in the Balkans, her story was reborn. Scholars and poets reclaimed her from Roman slander, painting her not as a pirate but as the first defender of Albanian independence, a woman who stood alone before empire and refused to bend. She was transformed again, not into myth, but into symbol. Statues rose in her honor, her crown imagined anew, her stern profile facing the sea. Modern Albania adopted her as a national icon. In her, people found both defiance and grief, the two faces of survival. The same Rome that once called her barbaric had, unintentionally, made her immortal. It is strange how history bends. The Romans built roads, aqueducts, and empires meant to last forever, yet most of them lie in ruins. Teuta, who left behind no monuments, endures in memory. That is the paradox of power. The structures of the conqueror crumble, while the stories of the conquered remain alive in song. Her legend traveled further than any Roman fleet. But Teuta's legacy is not just political, it is human. She represents a kind of courage that does not ask permission. Her rule was not perfect. Her decisions brought ruin as much as pride. Yet she lived in a world where women were expected to marry, not command. To grieve, not govern. She did both, and history still shivers at the audacity. Even now, her defiance feels intimate, the private rebellion of anyone who has ever stood alone and said no. In art and folklore, she evolved again. Some stories made her a sea goddess, her ships turning to foam at the edge of storms. Others imagined her wandering cliffs as a restless spirit, mourning the lost sound of her fleet. In northern Albania, there is a legend that when the sea grows suddenly rough, it is Teuta's anger rising, the queen reminding the living that the sea remembers everything. Such myths soften her edges but keep her essence, untamed, uncontained, unforgotten. And beyond legend, she left a quiet influence on how later generations imagined leadership. In a region often ruled by men of conquest and compromise, Teuta became the opposite, proof that power could look like defiance, not diplomacy. During the 20th century, as the Balkans fractured and rebuilt, her name resurfaced whenever people spoke of independence, of the right to resist larger powers. History recycled her rebellion into identity. The contrast between how Rome saw her and how her descendants remember her says everything about the politics of memory. For one side, she was disorder. For the other, dignity. Both descriptions are true in their way. Rebellion always looks like chaos from the perspective of control. But what Rome called chaos was, for Teuta, survival, the only kind available to a small nation caught between empires. If you walk through modern Shkodër, her bronze statue still looks out toward the water. Her face is calm, almost severe, her eyes level with the horizon. Around her, children play, tourists take photos, and life hums on. Few pause to think that 2,000 years ago, she was the most feared woman in the Mediterranean. But perhaps that is fitting. The sea that once carried her ships now carries stories instead. Both travel endlessly, changing shape but never truly sinking. Her afterlife in history mirrors the Aztecs' idea of visible justice. Just as the Aztecs believed moral truth should be enacted for all to see, Teuta's defiance became a public act that outlived her defeat. Her story, retold and re-seen, became a form of justice not in courts or chronicles, but in memory. Where Rome silenced her voice, time lifted it again. In that way, she won the only victory that matters, endurance. When we talk about legacy, we often think of monuments, treaties, borders. Teuta's was simpler and deeper, an idea. The idea that resistance itself can be inheritance. That even when you lose, if you lose on your own terms, history might eventually remember the courage more than the outcome. That is how empires fade and legends begin. She is part of a long, quiet lineage, people who stood in impossible places and said, "Not yet." The Aztec judges who held trials in open air, the farmers who obeyed moral law over written rule, the queen who told Rome that the sea belonged to no one. Each, in their way, refused invisibility. Each believed that to exist publicly, even in punishment or defeat, was to be remembered. And that is what remains of Queen Teuta, not the ports she lost, not the empire that conquered her, but the silhouette of defiance carved into the Adriatic horizon. Empires crumble. Statues weather. But her story, sharp, salt-touched, luminous, still rises with the tide. The story of Lewis and Clark begins with a letter, written by a man who had never seen the Pacific. Thomas Jefferson, philosopher and president, dreamed of a republic stretching from one ocean to the other, a geography of possibility. But between those two oceans lay mystery, vast lands, unknown peoples, and rivers no map had traced. Jefferson wanted to know what lived there, what could be traded, what could be claimed. In 1803, when the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France, the dream became urgent. The continent had doubled overnight. Now someone had to go find what, exactly, had been bought. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were chosen not only for courage but for curiosity. Jefferson did not want conquerors. He wanted observers. They would travel west to study the land, its rivers, its plants, its animals, and its inhabitants, and to make contact with the indigenous nations who already lived there. The expedition would carry both gifts and guns, peace medals and compasses. It was a mission written as science but shaped as empire. In May 1804, the Corps of Discovery, some 40 men, a dog, and a handful of ambitions too large for any one boat, left St. Louis. They pushed upstream against the Missouri River's will, their oars biting water that seemed endless. Their journals read like prayers and inventories, new species of plants, tribes met along the shore. Storms that nearly split their canoes. Some nights, they spoke of destiny. Other nights, only of hunger. The journey became a slow negotiation between wonder and survival. They met the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes, whose hospitality kept them alive through the brutal winter. They hunted buffalo across plains so wide that the horizon seemed to tilt. They mapped rivers, mountains, and plateaus, each name they gave a small act of claiming. Yet the deeper they went, the more they realized the continent was not a blank canvas. It was already drawn by trails, alliances, and sacred sites older than their country. Jefferson's instructions had been precise: gather data, record everything, seek a continuous water route to the Pacific, the fabled Northwest Passage. But nature had other designs. The Rocky Mountains rose before them like a wall, and the easy river to the sea they would hoped for did not exist. What they found instead was humility and help. Help came in the form of Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who joined the expedition with her infant son and French-Canadian husband. She became its quiet compass, translating, guiding, and often mediating between strangers. When the Corps reached Shoshone territory, it was she who recognized her own brother as the tribal chief, a moment so improbable that even Lewis and Clark wrote of it as providence. Through her, they traded for horses, crossed the mountains, and reached lands no white American had seen. Her presence often disarmed suspicion. To many tribes, the sight of a woman with a baby signaled peaceful intent. She was both bridge and shield. By November 1805, the expedition reached the Pacific Ocean near present-day Oregon. They had crossed nearly 4,000 miles of wild terrain. Standing on the coast, rain whipping their faces, Lewis wrote, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." It was triumph, yes, but not the end. They had to make the journey back. And if the westward path had been about discovery, the return was about endurance. They retraced rivers swollen with spring flood, hunted when they could, and wrote when they could not. By the time they returned to St. Louis in 1806, they had been gone more than 2 years. What they brought back was more than maps. They carried knowledge of geography, ecology, diplomacy. They described more than 200 new plants and animals, prairie dogs, mountain goats, grizzly bears. They charted rivers and passes that would later shape migration and trade. But the expedition's most enduring legacy was not what it found. It was what it began. Lewis and Clark returned as heroes. Jefferson celebrated them as proof that the American experiment could stretch across a continent. Their journals became scripture for expansion, the beginning of manifest destiny. Before the phrase existed, the line between exploration and possession blurred. What had started as science became prophecy. Yet behind the triumph, there were quieter truths. The journey had depended on indigenous generosity, on tribes who fed, guided, and tolerated them. Without that network of aid, the core of discovery would have been a story of disappearance, not success. The maps they drew were layered on top of older ones, erasing names that had been spoken for centuries. Every route marked progress for some and loss for others. Lewis himself never quite returned whole. The endless openness that had sustained him in the wild turned heavy in civilization. He struggled with debt, depression, and disillusionment. 3 years after the expedition, he died under mysterious circumstances, an apparent suicide along the Natchez Trace. Clark lived longer, raising Sacagawea's son for a time and serving as governor of Missouri Territory. The map that had united them split their lives apart. Still, the myth remained: 2 men, a river, and a continent waiting to be written. The expedition became the American creation story, a tale of courage and curiosity told without the discomfort of conquest. The image of Lewis and Clark staring westward endures because it flatters us. The dream of endless discovery, the illusion of unclaimed land. But when you read their journals closely, another tone hums beneath the patriotism all. Lewis marveling at a wolf's gaze, Clark sketching a mountain's shadow at dawn. The men were explorers, yes, but also witnesses to a world far older and more complex than their mission could measure. For every claim they made, they also confessed ignorance. Their expedition reminds us that discovery often begins with misunderstanding. Their journey, like the Aztec law or Teuta's rebellion, reveals how power cloaks itself in purpose. The Aztecs used justice to preserve order. Teuta used piracy to defend autonomy. Jefferson used exploration to expand empire. Each believed their system was righteous. Each turned necessity into virtue. History, with its dry humor, watches them all make the same mistake to confuse curiosity with right. And yet, there is still something beautiful in the image: 2 figures standing at the edge of the Pacific, drenched and stunned, realizing they have touched the farthest point their civilization could imagine. For a moment, the politics fall away. What remains is the human need to see what lies beyond the next bend, even if the seeing changes nothing. That is the paradox of exploration: it ends where understanding should begin. Lewis and Clark did not find the Northwest Passage. But they found a version of America that would haunt its conscience forever: vast, wild, interconnected, alive. They proved that discovery is not about finding new worlds, but realizing you were never alone in them. And maybe that is why their story still matters. In every age, someone sails west across seas, into space, into memory, hoping to find something unnamed. The lesson they left behind is quieter than the myth. Wonder is not ownership, and the world, however mapped, remains larger than we imagine. Long before the core of discovery crossed its first river, the land already belonged to 1,000 nations. To them, the explorers were not discoverers but visitors, curious, uncertain, sometimes lost. Survival, for Lewis and Clark, depended less on their instruments than on the kindness of strangers. The maps they drew were built from borrowed wisdom. The kind that came from people who had lived with the land long enough to speak its language. The expedition met dozens of tribes: the Oto, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce. Each encounter was its own negotiation between fear and hospitality. Sometimes it began with gifts, beads, knives, blankets, and ended in trade or uneasy truce. Other times, it began with silence, both sides waiting for the other to show meaning before movement. But through all these exchanges, one truth held: without native help, there would have been no expedition to record. The Mandan saved them first. When winter closed in on the upper Missouri, their fortified villages became shelter. The Americans, half-starved and frostbitten, were given food, furs, and advice on the lands ahead. From the Mandan they learned not only how to endure the cold but how to read it: the way snow clung to trees, the way ice formed on river edges, what those signs said about the weather to come. The tribe's generosity was pragmatic, not naive. They saw potential allies in trade, not saints of science. It was there, in that winter fort, that they met a young woman who would become the expedition's quiet axis, Sacagawea. She was Shoshone by birth, captured as a girl by the Hidatsa, later sold or traded into a household with a French-Canadian fur trapper, Toussaint Charbonneau. When Lewis and Clark hired him as interpreter, they also gained her, though neither side yet realized the weight of that decision. Sacagawea was no official guide in title, but in spirit she became the thread that kept the expedition from unraveling. She carried her infant son, Jean-Baptiste, through snow, mud, and rapids, often walking miles beside the boats. Her knowledge of edible plants, river crossings, and tribal customs turned survival into possibility. She rarely spoke in the journals, her voice recorded only through others, but her presence changed the story. Where the men saw wilderness, she saw home. When the Corps finally reached Shoshone territory, Sacagawea recognized the chief as her own brother, Kamiwait. It sounds like fiction, but it is history, a coincidence so improbable that even hardened soldiers wept. Through her, the expedition secured the horses they needed to cross the Rocky Mountains. Without that reunion, they would likely have perished in the snow. She was translator, diplomat, and symbol all at once. To the tribes they met, her presence, especially with her child, signaled peace. No war party traveled with a woman carrying a baby. To the explorers, she was reassurance that the unknown could be navigated, not conquered, but moved through with humility. Lewis's journal often notes her calm when the men panicked, her steadiness during storms or near drownings. At one point, when their boat capsized, she rescued papers, instruments, and supplies that would have been lost. Her influence was not loud. It was structural. She softened what could have been a march into a dialogue. The expedition, meant to extend empire, became at least for moments a conversation between worlds. Through her, Jefferson's dream of discovery met the reality of interdependence. The Nez Perce continued that chain of generosity months later. When the expedition stumbled out of the mountains, starving and ragged, the Nez Perce took them in, fed them salmon and roots, taught them to build canoes. They could have finished the story right there with violence, not mercy, but they did not. Their restraint was the most powerful gift of all. The irony is that none of these nations were thanked in proportion to their role. The expedition returned east with medals and fame. The tribes faced waves of settlers who would erase or exile them within a generation. Sacagawea's image would later appear on coins, her name on rivers and schools, yet her people's lands shrank with every map drawn from her guidance. She became myth, while the living world she represented was pushed to the margins of that myth. Still, the legend of Sacagawea carries a moral weight that resists romanticization. She reminds us that exploration is not discovery unless it acknowledges those who already knew the way. Her silence in the record is not absence, it is testimony. She did not need to write. She lived the expedition's truest line, that survival is shared work. When Lewis and Clark stood at the Pacific, they saw achievement. She saw continuity, the same rivers feeding new ones. The same sky spanning every nation. Her journey was never about conquering distance. It was about holding it together. She showed that leadership can be quiet, that courage can look like endurance, that history often travels on the shoulders of those it forgets to name. If you picture her at the river's edge, her son on her back, watching the sea she would never cross again, the image feels both small and infinite. She is not legend. She is balance, the human bridge that made two worlds meet for a fleeting, fragile moment of cooperation. The explorers went west to claim. She walked west to return. And in that reversal lies the truth the expedition never saw. Discovery has always been a shared act, and the most powerful guides are often the ones history barely hears. Beneath Istanbul's streets, beyond neon and car horns, there is a world that breathes quietly. A staircase leads down, smelling faintly of stone and damp iron. At the bottom, the air changes. Marble columns rise from shallow water, reflections doubling the world. The ceiling glows amber. Drops fall, one by one, like a slow heartbeat. This is the Basilica Cistern, built nearly 1500 years ago, when Constantinople's emperor believed that engineering and beauty should speak the same language. The cistern began with necessity. The city needed water reliable, clean, abundant. Constantinople's population had outgrown the aqueducts. Emperor Justinian, ruling from 527 to 565, decided to store the overflow underground. He built not merely a cistern, but a cathedral to function, 336 columns, each carved differently, holding 80,000 cubic meters of water. Engineers diverted streams through clay pipes and tunnels, creating the city's hidden heart. But the Byzantines never settled for practicality alone. They carved capitals, decorated arches, and placed two massive Medusa heads at the base of columns, one sideways, one upside down. No one knows why. Perhaps they were symbols of protection. Perhaps spoils from older temples. Either way, even utility wore mystery like jewelry. When it opened, few citizens knew of it. Water arrived through fountains and baths above ground. The cistern's existence was trust between ruler and engineer, a hidden promise that the city would not thirst. Empires often depend on the unseen. Centuries passed. The city changed names and empires. Earthquakes cracked walls. Invasions emptied palaces. The cistern flooded, drained, filled again with silt and silence. By the Ottoman conquest in 1453, the reservoir had been forgotten. Locals drew water from basements, unaware they were tapping an emperor's ghost. Travelers told stories of carp pulled from holes in the floor, fish that had never seen sunlight. It was rediscovered in the 16th century by Petrus Gillius, a scholar who followed the rumors of fish. When his torchlight struck a column, he realized he had found a forgotten wonder, an underground palace built for water. Yet the cistern remained mostly neglected for 400 more years. Today, it is a strange sanctuary. Tourists walk on wooden platforms where emperors once hid their engineering. The water is shallow, lit from below, the Medusas watching through ripples. The air smells of limestone and old time. Musicians sometimes play, their notes echoing slowly, like breath. It is not a museum of artifacts, but of endurance. Its haunting comes from silence. Everything grand that once filled the empire, armies, courts, churches, is gone. What remains is infrastructure, still performing its purpose. The water still moves. The columns still stand. The cistern is a reminder, civilization survives through what it builds to last unseen. Justinian, like the Aztecs or Teuta, believed order required visibility. Yet the cistern shows another truth: strength can hide itself. Justice, defiance, exploration, empire, these needed an audience. Stability, the quiet kind that sustains life, often happens underground. The Medusa heads capture this inversion perfectly. Myths say her gaze turned men to stone, but here she is turned, neutralized, repurposed as foundation. Fear becomes support. Terror becomes trust. That is the logic of Byzantium: nothing wasted, everything transformed. Listen long enough and you hear centuries, drop, echo, pause. Even in crowds, people whisper. The space demands reverence. It feels like metaphor: empires rise through spectacle, but endure through plumbing. The cistern kept Constantinople alive through sieges and droughts. When politics failed, infrastructure saved. The engineers may not have intended poetry, But they built one anyway, a hymn to persistence. Emerging back to sunlight, the modern city feels loud and crude. The cistern waits in silence. Its lesson: greatness does not always need to be seen to be felt. It completes a cycle: Aztec justice, Teuta's defiance, Lewis and Clark's discovery, all spectacle above ground, but beneath lies endurance. The cistern is the underside of civilization, showing that beauty can be practical and practicality beautiful. Justinian built it for water. But it ended up storing time. Every falling drop continues an empire that no longer exists, yet in the echo, you feel its pulse. If the Aztec plaza was justice in daylight, the basilica cistern is justice in shadow, unseen, sustaining, essential. One teaches through spectacle. The other, through endurance. The stones do not care which empire claims them. They just keep holding the ceiling up. From the Aztec plazas to the Illyrian coast. From the rivers of America to the silent cisterns under Byzantium, the stories begin to rhyme. Different centuries, different gods, but the same pattern: people building shapes around their fear of collapse. Justice, rebellion, discovery, endurance, all variations of the same song, how to make meaning before it slips away. The Aztecs turned law into performance. Every trial, every punishment was a moral spectacle meant to keep the sun rising. Queen Teuta turned defiance into theater, declaring freedom from a cliff until empire answered back. Lewis and Clark carried a republic's curiosity into wilderness and found dependence disguised as discovery. Justinian hid his strength underground, trading spectacle for stability. They were all doing the same thing, trying to hold the world still, even for a moment. Civilization, it turns out, is not defined by peace or war or faith. It is defined by choreography, the human impulse to arrange chaos into form. Sometimes that form is a plaza full of witnesses, sometimes a fleet of pirate ships, sometimes a map drawn in trembling ink, sometimes a hall of water beneath a city. The impulse is identical: make it visible, make it durable, make it mean something. You can see the pattern even in failure. The Aztec justice system vanished with conquest, but its memory survives in the stories of public accountability. Teuta's kingdom fell. Yet her name still guards the Adriatic like a ghost. Lewis and Clark's expedition ended, but their maps redrew the nation's imagination. The basilica cistern, forgotten for centuries, outlasted every throne above it. When the empires that built them dissolved, the structures moral, physical, symbolic remained. All these worlds were held together by a fragile equilibrium between control and chaos. The Aztecs believed the universe itself could collapse if justice was not performed correctly. The Byzantines believed God watched over even their plumbing. The Americans believed exploration could justify expansion. And Teuta believed that to yield would be to disappear. Each story hides the same confession: no one ever feels secure for long. What makes these stories human is not their victories but their contradictions. The Aztecs sought cosmic balance but practiced ruthless efficiency. Rome claimed order but built it from conquest. The explorers searched for knowledge yet carried the seeds of erasure. The Byzantines prayed for eternity and buried it under stone. We repeat these paradoxes because they are the price of survival. We want to control the world even as we know it cannot be controlled. Still, there is something noble in the effort. To build, to codify, to explore, to preserve, these are our defenses against meaninglessness. Justice systems and sea wars, expeditions and cisterns are all, in their way, acts of hope. Even punishment, rebellion, and empire begin with the same faith, that human action matters. That we can shape our surroundings into something just, or at least lasting. Maybe that is why we keep returning to these stories. The Aztec judge, the Illyrian queen, the American explorer, the Byzantine engineer, they live on not because they were right, but because they remind us that order is always temporary and always worth remaking. The plaza crumbles. The empire burns, the map fades, the cistern fills with dust, and still, someone new begins again, sketching structure over uncertainty. There is comfort in that repetition. It means we are never the first to try and never the last to fail. The faces change, the materials evolve, but the instinct endures. To see the law enacted beneath the sun, to stand unbowed before an empire, to draw the outline of a river, to build a reservoir against thirst, these are not separate stories. They are one long meditation on how to live in a world that does not stay still. If there is a single lesson buried in all these centuries, it is this: what we build in stone, in word, in will is less important than why we build it. The Aztecs feared the gods might abandon them. Justinian feared drought. Teuta feared submission. Jefferson feared ignorance. Every act of creation or defiance was an answer to fear. Every column, every voyage, every trial was a prayer for continuity disguised as achievement. And in that sense, civilization is not a collection of monuments. It is a gesture, the act of reaching toward order, again and again, knowing it will eventually fall. The beauty is not in the permanence but in the persistence. The Aztecs' plazas are gone. But their idea of visible morality survives. Teuta's fleets have rotted, but her defiance still echoes in the sea's wind. Lewis and Clark's trails have become highways, but their ore remains in the American imagination. The basilica cistern still hums under the city, outlasting every name its surface has worn. All these worlds whisper the same quiet truth: the point was never to win forever. The point was to keep trying. Because maybe the most human thing we do is look at chaos, the flood, the empire, the blank map, the dark, and decide to build anyway. And so, we circle back to where it all began, people staring into the unknown and trying to name it. Whether it was a judge in Tenochtitlan, a queen on the Adriatic, an explorer in the wilderness, or an emperor's engineer underground, every story was really the same act of faith, to make meaning from disorder. Civilizations come and go. But the gesture repeats. We still build systems, draw borders, search maps, store water. We still hope that structure will save us from impermanence. And maybe it does for a while. What lasts is not the empires or the buildings, but the stubborn rhythm of trying again. If there is a single thread binding the Aztec square to the Roman fleet, the American expedition to the Byzantine cistern, it is this: we are builders, even in collapse. Every age thinks it is the last, yet someone always begins another foundation. That is our quiet genius, not perfection, but persistence. Thanks for wandering through these worlds with me today. If you are still here, maybe you see it too, that strange comfort in knowing every story of order is also a story of hope. Until next time, take care of your small empires. And keep the water flowing.